But anyway, I think I'm going to start. If you're interested in following along, I have created an e-reader on my website. If you go to the link in the description, I believe, should be ndhfilms.com/writing/short stories/skeleton.html. You can also go to my main page of my website, ndhfilms.com, and I have a link in the top article to the e-reader. But I want to thank everyone who's watching. I always appreciate people listening to what I have to say. And I think it's a fun time to enjoy a scary story with Halloween on the way. The story is called Then a Skeleton Popped Out. And it's going to take about 45 minutes to read. But after that, I'm happy to answer questions in the chat. If you have a YouTube account, it should be on this side or that side of the screen, or maybe below. You can also tweet me. My Twitter handle is @ndhfilms. Or if you have my personal info, you can send it to me that way. But anyway, I think we should get started. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll stick around. Then a Skeleton Popped Out by Nicholas Bernhard. Sometimes I get asked about my dad and his work. This usually happens at bioscience conferences, where a celebrity endures. These questions begin at the hotel bar, after someone reads my conference badge and recognizes the last name. They want to know about the day Dad unveiled the skeleton. In all my years of conferences, I've never told anyone about that fall semester. They imagine I beheld Dad's revolutionary inventions with the same wonder as the myrrh bearers who came upon Jesus' empty tomb. I know it's hard for them to hear, with me being his son and his student, but I tell them I'm the wrong one to ask. So, I've let those questions die in the air of the hotel bars and conference halls. Then, last month, Dr. Hendricks over at the medical school called me. He'd started a volunteer group, reading stories to the persistently vegetative patients in the coma ward. The university recently set volunteer quotas for professors, and he wanted his friends in bioscience to have first dibs. The coma ward is in a far wing of the teaching hospital. Tonight, it's just the graveyard shift and the patients. It's been painful to hide this story. The human urge to tell all can be overwhelming. After all these years, the story doesn't have to die at the hotel bar. It can die with you. Dad had spent all summer working in the basement. After Mom left and the money from Dad's Genius Grant ran out, we'd moved to the High Plains. He worked as a science teacher at William Waddell High, Sedgwick School District RE2. It was a Saturday night, and I'd hitched a ride to the outskirts of Sedgwick for Vanessa's last party of the summer. Vanessa's party was at an old house along County Road 5. The brass-plated chandelier in the dining room wobbled in its fixture, spurred on by the beat of the electro dance music upstairs. Cans of cheap beer clanked as they collided in the ice water of the kitchen sink. Upstairs, there was usually an assortment of pills from everyone's medicine cabinets. I didn't touch that stuff. I just let the dull cut of the beer buzz around in the back of my brain. The beer came from Deanne, the golden child at school. Same went for the slate, sleek Escalades that had chauffeured the varsity football team. Dean wasn't the kind to call himself a gift from God. Other people did it for him. When he moved here a couple years ago, he became the varsity team's first ever sophomore starting quarterback. His father was a liaison for Guangzhou Drilling, a Chinese firm that had put millions into the gas drilling potential of the Panhandle. It also helped that Dean wasn't built like a quarterback. He was built like a Sherman tank. I have never heard a crowd roar with quite so much visceral, unhinged ecstasy as the one at Dean's first playoff game with the Sedgwick Riders. He'd scored a touchdown with 4 Lamar Homesteaders trailing off of him. The crowd erupted, and he just stood there in the end zone, arms flat at his side, the Lamar players lying in the grass. The Lamar team didn't even try for another touchdown the rest of the night. Soon, people were driving all the way from Denver and Omaha to see him play. The beer was going right through me. I needed a piss real bad. That meant a possible encounter with Dean. I could hear him upstairs, size 15 shoes thudding through the floorboards. These were followed by the clatter of stiletto heels. I guessed it was Vanessa. She ran the pep rallies. I figured that in 2 minutes, Dean would have her bent over the upstairs sink. Perks of the varsity team. If I didn't pee soon, the bathroom would be occupied, and I'd be doing it in the bushes. I got to the top of the wooden staircase, balancing my beer in its red cup. There was something oddly pleasant about drinking as you stood over the bowl peeing, but I was too afraid to ask if anyone else shared the sensation. The electro dance pounded out of the first bedroom, overflowing with dancing students. The far hallway light was broken, and I saw Dean's form in the shadow. His shoulders almost spanned the hallway width. Beyond him, I heard a strained giggling. I could see Vanessa, cheeks red from liquor, teetering on her heels. She was laughing, but it was laughter meant to diffuse tension. She was telling Dean that she had to get back downstairs. Someone needed to ask her a question. If she wasn't back down soon, they were going to be mad. Dean took a step forward, pushing them both toward the back bedroom. Vanessa laughed again and said Dean was being stupid. The light from the one good bulb in the hall caught her eyes, looking around for a friend, but her friends couldn't hear her over the pounding music. She laughed once more, and her smile turned to something nauseous and desperate. I grabbed Vanessa's wrist. "Didn't you have something to ask me?" I said. "Get out of here," said Dean. Vanessa squinted in my direction, as if she couldn't recognize me. "Yeah, it's fine. Everything's fine." "See," said Dean. "Everything's fine." He stepped forward again, and Vanessa had to step back, almost to the far bedroom's door jamb. Dean tapped me on the shoulder. From him, it felt like a hard shove. "Back downstairs." I looked at Vanessa. Is that right? You're good?" She looked up at Dean, having to crane her neck to do so. She looked back at me, that same look that was close to a dry heave. "Yeah, Quint, just get out of here, okay? No one needs you here." I took a step back in surprise. Dean turned toward me, the hallway floor creaking under the weight of his feet. "No one needs you here," he repeated. This time he did shove me to the wall. I heard a photo frame crack behind me. Dean nudged his head right, a signal for me to crawl back to the living room couch. He looked down with a sneer. "Fucking faggot." Sometimes, when you're drunk, words take on mass, and they can push you side to side. I guess I didn't realize how sloshed I was, because the instant those 2 words left Dean's mouth, I flicked my wrist, sending my drink into his face. It sounds like a move by a brooding anti-hero. It wasn't. It was beer, weak beer. I didn't order vodka and Tabasco sauce on the off chance I'd need to take down a burly assailant at the bar. The move bought me 1 second of Dean's confusion as I pulled Vanessa toward the stairs. Vanessa was yelling at me to let go when one of her heels buckled on a stair, sending her crashing into me. I saw the rays of approaching headlights outside, and I pulled Vanessa toward the front door. With only one heel, Vanessa lurched and knee-kicked her way behind me. We got outside just as the car was pulling up. The Harvey brothers, Eric and Stan, from Ray, stragglers to every party. I yanked the passenger door open. "Hey man, Vanessa's been puking all over. You gotta get her to the drugstore." Eric started to get out. "Let someone else take her." "Come on, man," I pleaded. "She needs to get out of here now." I felt my entire body mass slam into the car with a metallic thud and get yanked back up again. I stumbled, trying to find my footing. Vanessa put a hand on Dean's arm as he lumbered toward me. She was telling him to stop, that it was a misunderstanding. In the front yard, the floodlights caught Dean's bloodshot eyes, channeling a rage that was gift-wrapped with a bow on top for me and me alone. His arms didn't swing as he walked up to me, and I felt a warm spot forming around the fly of my jeans. I made my first and only move, and my one mistake. I put my arms up in non-resistance. Dean took a swing, a fist to my right cheekbone. My knees buckled. I hit the dirt. A soft red shape with wriggling tendrils appeared before my eyes. When my vision cleared, Dean was on top of me, and a knee smashed my balls. The pain radiated up from my groin to my guts. I felt my mouth coat with a tangy spit that precedes puking. Dean socked me on the nose, and the shapes in front of my eyes turned purple and gelatinous. I heard voices all around. My vision briefly resolved to the sight of a crowd gathered in the driveway. I felt my neck bend as my chest was yanked up by my shirt collar. All I saw was the shadow looming above me, the floodlight still catching the bloody hate set in the sockets. Dean brought my face up to his, and made a taurine snort that blew my hair back. "Mind your business, faggot." Every time I was lifted off the ground, I got socked from the front, and the earth came up behind me for another hit. Something hot and wet was flowing down my face. Somewhere, Vanessa was screaming. My hand shot up to fight off the blow I knew was coming. Dean's left hook came for my ear, and I heard the low tolling of some dark bell. I'm told I still don't hear as well on that side. Dean pulled his fist back again. My gasp for air turned into a cry. "Dean, stop!" shrieked Vanessa. The punch hit my mouth at a weird angle. I felt the flesh of his hand grind against the edge of my upper teeth. I heard a yelp. In my right eye, I saw Dean holding his bloodied hand and sucking on it. For a flash, Dean was gone, replaced by a frightened toddler who has learned by first-hand experience that mommy's curling iron is very, very hot. The cut looked deep. He looked like he might cry. Dean uncradled his hand. His body lifted. The next punch would carry the whole of his weight. I heard a sound that was both soppy and cracking, like when you bite into the joint of a chicken leg, as what was left of my nose gave way. The purple shapes before my eyes spilled over into black ink, and I passed out. When you get knocked out, you're not out for a long time. That's movie bull. I was awake shortly afterward, but I wish I hadn't been. All I remember is my head coiling in on itself as it throbbed to my heartbeat. The lights in the ER hallway burned white hot. Sometime later, I woke up again and heard voices behind the hospital curtain. I recognized one of them as the physician. The other voice was asking the physician about new coagulants on the market. It was Dad. He didn't ask much about me. The Sunday before school started, I found myself sitting in the principal's office. The high school athletic director stared at me from the corner. My nose was still bandaged, and my face had as many colors on it as a crayon box. The principal directed my gaze to the office window. I saw a northern view of the football field. Beyond the gridiron, I saw the frame of an unfinished 3-story building. That, I was told, was the future Gwangju Sports Center. It would be the most advanced high school athletic center in 100 miles. Every cent was paid for by Dean's family. The athletic director was leaning against the filing cabinets, arms folded. "Dean says you're the one who cut him on the hand. You could have severed a tendon or an artery. Try throwing a pass when your hand won't stop twitching. Do you realize what you could have done to our team, you little shit?" The T at the end came with a hard click. "Dean's father was very upset," said the principal. "The school is very lucky they didn't pull him out." My head was aching more every minute. I'm not sure Vanessa would agree. "Listen, smart mouth," said the director. "You think you're big because your dad teaches science here? You think a lot of book smarts makes you better than Dean? You think it makes you better than me?" He was leaning over me by then, the overhead light shining off his crown line. It hurt to look up at him. "He was going to rape her," I said. There was a long sigh from across the desk. The director shot his eyes over to the principal, who returned a look of assurance. "I tried," said the principal. "2 days detention, young man." Before I could register the news, the director put his face inches from mine. "I want to see this school get fat off Dean. No he said, she said, clouded by booze will get in the way. Dean means fiscal generosity to the school and raw athletic potential. A football dynasty. I call that a gift from God. Do you believe in God, Quint?" I told him I did. I still do. "I won't have our school's rising star slandered," said the principal. "Try to remember that it's not always about you." The sky was already darkening as I walked home. I began to notice a gamey smell in the air. It was smoke. A few miles from my house, the land rises up to a hill, crowned by a grove of cottonwood trees. The profile of each tree was visible to me, lit up in a glow. The fire glow reminded me of driving with Dad to a Christmas pageant in Fort Morgan, where the lights of the city made the clouds glow a dim orange. The fire must have been some distance beyond the trees. I couldn't hear any sirens, and the air was very still that night. I entered the front door. The living room lights were flickering and popping, which meant Dad was running his experiments downstairs. A note on the door told me there was Mugu Gai Pan in the microwave, and that he'd be up for the news at 7. I threw my clothes off and took a shower. I removed the nose bandage. The dried blood fell away from my nose and snaked into the drain. Everywhere I focused, I found a murky tar pit of hate. I felt that hate in every atom of my body. I moved away from Sedgwick long ago and have been married 7 years now, but I hope my wife never learns the full extent of the hate I felt that night and the things I wished for. Looking back, it set the stage for everything that followed. The smoke from the fire made my nose run. I fell asleep staring at the ceiling, thinking of the long day ahead, a long week, a long life. School at 7:30 a.m. on a Monday. What a sick joke. Ride a bus through the rainy September cold with a broken heater, then sit in a classroom bathed in humming fluorescents and the stench of dissection preservatives. I tried to clear my mind, but I kept thinking about the coating on my teeth, made by the syrup on my waffles. Dad stood in front of the class in his lab coat. "For far too long," he said, "the public school system has seen fit to instruct students of biology using the flat pages of a committee-designed textbook and chloroformed frogs. We are far removed from the great naturalists who studied at Venice and Padua with human cadavers. I have been warned by the local health board to not resume that practice." My dad moved over to a corner of the classroom behind his cramped pasteboard desk. In the shadow of the broom closet, a shrouded figure was standing. I hadn't noticed it before. "Today," he said, "we make history. I have spent the past year developing special processes and compounds that will imitate the very anatomical methods you'll learn." Dad unsnapped a button on the shroud. It pulled to the floor. It was a skeleton, bleached and hanging high on a hook. It was nothing we hadn't seen before in an earlier class, the cliché of every science classroom in high school movies. Dad kept talking. I had never seen him so excited about something. "This here is a bleeding-edge replica of my own design. It was made by the application of gelatin kiln molding, silicate case hardening, and ancient Polynesian scrimshaw. Do not be alarmed by the family resemblance, students. What you see is not real. What you see is not real." That didn't feel right. The skeleton was there in front of us. The lecture passed by in a blur. I had learned most of it by reading through Dad's home library. He talked about our skeleton's distinctions from the great apes and old world monkeys, and then the commonalities it shared with all vertebrates. He charted our skeletal lineage in reverse, relating millions of years in a few sentences, all the way back to the primeval Devonian epoch, when the first proto-crocodilians crawled from the sludgy shores of Panthalassa. The bell rang, and I filed out past the skeleton. Up close, I could see millimeter grooves and ridges of the bones. The plates of the nose didn't come together at a clean angle. There were slight chips at the edges, and it was hollow in between. God, the thing was convincing. I walked back along the football field and realized something was missing. Most days I'd walk to class as the varsity team finished their 5:30 a.m. practice. Each time, Dan would be training on the tackle sled, and his impacts thundered up the street. There was a flock of pigeons that roosted in the frame of the Gwangju Sports Center, and the impacts would send them into a slapdash flight over the gridiron. As I'd come into school that morning, the football team was finishing up. The thunderous crash of Dean against the tackle sled was gone. The football team had an away game in Hoyt on Wednesday. When Dean didn't show up, a palpable unease began bubbling in the halls. Without their quarterback, the Sedgwick Riders lost the lead in the first half and never took it back. The next Monday, Dad taught the nervous system. Overnight, he had applied the next stage to his skeleton. Rivulets of nerve tissue coursed down the spine and across the limbs. Dad stuck his pointer stick into a nerve strand at the base of the neck. Atop the bones lies man's gateway to knowledge. Electrical signals in the nervous system are generated by everything we touch, hear, taste, and see. Our ability to integrate these impulses into judgments leads to the possibility of survival. If our nerves sense cold, we ought to seek shelter. If our nerves tell us fire burns, then we ought not to touch it. If the nerves in our stomach wall react well to a new kind of food, then perhaps it is safe to eat. Only when we reject these impulses, we get wrong ones, or refuse to learn from them, is death certain. The nerves added to the skeleton. Before, you could think of it as a collection of bones, but now the nerves draped and sloped across the bones and tied them together. It was a system, parts made whole. A redhead kid named Bryce raised his hand. Could it feel now? He asked. I mean, what would we feel with only nerves? Dad tweaked his lips to a hint of a smile. You need a brain to feel, he said. That comes later. You would also need limbs and organs like the dermis on top to contextualize the sensations. Otherwise, every micron of the 45 miles of nerves would be exposed to the open air. Your whole body would feel like a deep wound scrubbed with salt and rubbing alcohol. It would be pain that makes an eternity of a second, for hour upon hour. We all glanced up at the skeleton, as if to get its take. The fractal nerves gave it a human appearance, but the hollow eye sockets seemed indifferent, too cool for school. When school got out, I headed for the front office. The receptionist handed me a stack of practice standardized tests. Dad graded them during lunch for extra money. I headed for his classroom to drop them off. I passed through the cafeteria, where the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panorama of the track, the football field, and the empty husk of the athletic complex. No one had seen any more work on it since Dean left. I heard a wrenching sound. It was the custodian mopping the floor. Before summer break, he told us that the donations from Gwangju Drilling meant big things for Waddell High. He thought a raise was on the horizon. Now he stared straight at me as he wrung the mop into his bucket, the plastic handle creaking in his hands. I got to Dad's classroom. In between a poster of the human genome and the window frame, I could see the lights were off inside. I dropped the papers on his desk. I turned around and stopped. 2 pinpoints of twinkling light caught my notice. Set into the skull of the skeleton were 2 eyes. For a second, I thought they were looking straight at me. My whole body clenched. I felt my nuts suck up into my body. As I moved away, I realized the eyes didn't track with mine. Instead, they converged on a point in the back of the classroom. Must have been Dad's attempt at humor. Right. What the hell was Dad doing in the basement? These eyes were not just convincing. In the years since, I have come to know a man with a glass eye. You would never know he had one unless he told you. But the eyes in the skull, they looked shiny and wet, like a newborn's eyes. I felt something slip inside my mind. Down the hallway, I heard someone crying. The custodian watched me as I left the classroom and followed the sound. I stepped into the auditorium. Vanessa was crying on the stage, surrounded by her friends. She saw me and started back in surprise. She told me that the school bus from Ovid went up a hill on County Road 8. At the hill's bottom, a small bridge crossed Cottonwood Creek. Just last week, they had noticed the bridge was charred and sooty at the bottom. The high school groupthink had tied the first sighting of this soot to the morning Dean didn't show up for practice. It didn't feel right. If Dean had been in a car accident, it would have been front-page news. There had been nothing. No reporters. No police. The principal and the athletic director had lockjaw. It's inappropriate to ask faculty about personnel matters, they said. As much as I pleaded with myself to be reasonable, I kept thinking of the orange fire glow that had encircled the hill that night. I could remember the gamey smell of smoke making my nose run. It filled my nose as I stood there in the auditorium. I didn't mean it, Vanessa whimpered. I didn't want him to die. I watched her fingers play with the gold cross on her necklace. It's not for us to say who dies. That's why we have to plan the memorial. My voice came out in a croak. Memorial? Vanessa stared off into the shadows of the auditorium balcony. When he died, the school died, she whispered. That new sports building is a tomb now. She gripped the cross in a fist, clenching her teeth. She sounded like she'd swallowed poison and was going to spit it up. I should burn in hell for the things I said. And what about Dean? I asked. The question came out sharper than I'd intended. Everyone looked toward me. Vanessa looked at me like I'd asked her something truly absurd that insulted common sense, like imagine water that isn't wet. Her reply came flat. He's gone, Quint. I turned back for the exit. He isn't gone, I thought. That's the problem. For the next 2 weeks, I only saw Dad at school. There was a shiny new deadbolt on the basement door, and the tart air of ozone coming up through the vents. I didn't come home except to sleep. The football team was enduring an unheard-of string of shutouts, and at some point the school decided I was to blame. I'd spent one lunch period mopping the hallway after someone packed my locker with water-filled condoms. A new coat of pink now spread across the skeleton's bones. These were the core skeletal muscles, regulating body movement, or as Dad put it, corporeal locomotion. Muscle fibers made a quilt-like patchwork across the face. Downward strips formed cheeks, and contours defined the shoulders and abdomen. As our spirits lowered, Dad's soared. You're as close as it gets, students. The high-tension fiber covering these bones, patent pending, is only a few protein folds away from the real thing. This is man below the hood, boys and girls. This is man stripped of his finery. This model is so authentic that he is decaying even as we speak. The synthetic muscle fibers are drying by the minute. Dad heaved a bucket onto his desk. It must be hydrated with a special emulsion every 24 hours. I could ask for volunteers, he began. Instead, I will thank the following selfless conscripts. Bryce and I painted the skeleton with Dad's cocktail 3 lunch periods a week. Always, the eyes in the body's head stared down from its high hook. The skeleton watched us every week as each new layer brought new, hideous aspects. Another layer of muscle was added which further defined the face. The wet, glistening fiber came to an abrupt end right before the lips, which Dad toiled over for hours each night. Every morning he'd shuffle around the kitchen as I ate breakfast, muttering about how he didn't have the lips quite right yet. Without the lips, the skull had peeled back into a bulging-eyed, ear-to-ear grin. It was the face of someone in a hospital after they'd had their jaw wired shut, and the anesthetic is wearing off. So nice of you to stop in. Gotta say, I've seen better days. As Bryce and I ran our brushes over the muscles, beads of milky fluid appeared on the chest and arms. I dipped my brush in the bucket and painted over it again. Now, the beads appeared on the legs and groin. I told Dad about it at home during a commercial break in the 7 o'clock news. He laced his fingers together and leaned back on the couch. Fascinating. The protein compounds must be undergoing a stress reaction. To what? I asked. Well, to the open air, he said. Muscle isn't meant to be exposed like that. It puts the body into shock, producing lactic acid. I often see it in my part-time work at the medical examiner's office. It's most obvious in motorcycle accidents, where the skin has been sanded away. I must make note for further study. Excuse me. Dad got up from the couch, and I heard him clomp down the stairs. I didn't know he was working with the ME again. That's where they processed all the bodies after car crashes. There was an incident that Friday. Vanessa had brush duty. When students came back from lunch, they found her huddled against the hallway lockers. In the classroom, the skeleton skull lay crooked on its shoulder, jaw wide open in what would have been a scream. Vanessa's brush sat in a red puddle on the floor, next to a snapped yardstick. She said nothing in detention. Wednesday. Dad had fixed the skull's jaw hinge. Bryce had learned how to get his brushing done fast. The face had pulled back even tighter, even though we'd been adding an extra coat. The eyes were starting to push out of their shrunken sockets. I heard there'd be a party on Saturday, back at Vanessa's place. A Halloween party. The football team would be there, not that they had anything else to do. They were miles from getting to this year's playoffs. I wasn't going to be caught dead at that party. I could just imagine myself pulling into that gravel lot and everyone looking at me in the very spot where I heard the voice, as clear, crisp, and unwanted in my mind as my 6:30 alarm clock. The bucket hit the floor. I looked over at Bryce. He was frozen, with the look of an animal that's heard the mountain lions approach too late. Without moving his head, except for the tiny shiver I saw building, he looked over at me, and I knew. We had both heard it. Mind your business, faggot. I turned around, and this time it wasn't the eyes of the skull looking back. I knew who it was. It was a corpse decomposing in reverse, unfolding backward from charred bones to scorching nerve endings to a flayed prisoner hanging in the commons for the spectacle of the villagers. I realized Vanessa had heard it too. She must have. The whole semester, he looked back on us in judgment. Our hatred had made this happen, and now he watched us, stripped and skinned, with that insane pearl-white smile at the torture we had inflicted. His eyes stayed locked with mine. Those eyes seemed to be pushing their way out of the skull, trying to close the distance between us, and I could hear the words from behind that broad row of glinting teeth burrow between my ears. You did this to me. I don't remember how I got home that night. I remember sitting upright in my unmade bed and covering my ears. My boombox was blasting out Korn so loud the bass rattled the bed frame. My clothes felt cold and wet on my body from sweating. I ran over to the window and pulled over the blinds. The sky was turning dark. School must have ended hours ago. I ran into the hall and checked the basement door. It was unlocked, and the light over the upstairs was off. Dad left it on if he was working downstairs. He never went out on Wednesdays. I felt the panic come on as a sharp pain in my chest. It radiated out across my body. As it fanned through my fingers, they curled into fists. I couldn't see, I couldn't breathe. Out here on the plains, people try not to get sick, since the ambulance could be an hour away. My flight instinct had kicked in, but I knew if I ran, I'd probably keel over on the dirty living room carpet. I braced myself against the wall and slid to the back door. We kept a rifle in the backyard tool shed. My hands were shaking so bad it took me 20 tries to load the 6 rounds. The rest lay on the floor. I spent a good 5 minutes curled up against the shed, with the rifle against my chest. I watched the last warm colors bleed from the sky. Then I realized I was an idiot. If something was coming to get me, it would have done it hours ago. I picked up the bullets and put the rifle back on its shelf. I was almost asleep when Dad came home around 11. On Friday morning, the stench of formaldehyde was thick in the classroom. "Bryce," I said. "Bryce!" Bryce looked up from his worksheet. "What?" "Hand me the forceps." It was dissection day. A gooey carp lay on each group table in the back of the classroom. I guess even with Dad's inventions, this particular tradition was ineradicable. I did the cutting. Bryce wrote down his observations. He handed me the forceps. I had 2 fingers holding open the carp's digestive system. Bryce's writing was one long scrawl. Every group's incisions along their carp's belly was rough and jagged. The insistent stare of the skull left us rushed, to say the least. The door swung open. Dad was cradling a heap of papers, wobbling side to side to keep them balanced. "Students, superlative news! The National Biology Education Board has published my findings. They just faxed over their acceptance letter. This will change the teaching of school anatomy forever. Now quick, finish those worksheets. I want us to take a photo with my creation." He shook his hands in a shooing motion. "Why aren't you finished anyway? Bryce, go around and staple those reports together, quickly." Bryce began moving from table to table, grabbing people's worksheets and binding them with the snap of a stapler. "Wait," said Vanessa. We looked over at her. Bryce stood in place. "Next week we're doing the memorial out by the athletic building." "Vanessa," I began. "We wanted to do it during assembly, but the principal said no. Anyone who's coming should meet during lunch." "Why?" I asked. "So we can go over how we're going to group everyone." "Bryce!" my dad shouted from his desk. "I don't hear a lot of stapling." Bryce resumed his duties. I grunted. "For Christ's sake, Vanessa, are we mourning the president?" I pushed through the rising uproar of the class. "Should we get a 21-gun salute?" "Quint," Vanessa snapped, "that toxic, shitty attitude is killing us. We're drowning in your hate." "Bryce, hold on a second." Bryce froze again. "I want to know," said Vanessa, "what gives you the right to speak ill of the dead? It's so selfish I could scream." "What about you?" I asked. "You better stop, Quint. How about you, huh? You told me you hated him, and you should burn in hell for it." My dad boomed from the other side of the room. "Bryce! I want those papers 5 minutes ago." Bryce dashed to the next table, offering Vanessa an apologetic look. Vanessa's eyes burned at me. I never... Her voice halted. She touched her cross necklace. I never wished him dead, Quint. If you wish someone dead, you've committed murder in your heart. Murder! She emphasized each syllable of the word. Then I guess I did, I said. I murdered him in my heart 1,000 times. He beat me to a bloody pulp in front of everyone. And what'd he try to do to you? Nothing, said Vanessa. I heard the snapping of the stapler at faster intervals. He didn't do anything to me, okay? But you said... Vanessa slapped a palm down. I heard a hard click as her purity ring hit the tabletop. He never did anything to me. He didn't hurt anybody, Quint. I loved him. I heard the stapler press down and a sharp gasp. Bryce's eyes were wide, looking down at the papers he just stapled through his thumb. Bryce ran toward Dad. Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God! He knocked his way through the grid of desks, flailing his hands. With the papers hanging from his thumb, he looked like a desperate soldier waving a white flag of surrender before the next mortar burst. I saw Bryce get his foot caught on the underseat rack of a student desk, propelling him forward on one foot. He made one awkward hop on the foot and crashed headfirst into the skeleton. It fell onto him with a heavy thud. Bryce was screaming in such a panic Dad couldn't grab hold. Bryce kept trying to push the skull away from his head, but his hand just slid off the slick muscle of the jawbone, opening it again and again as the spring hinge whined, "Ee! Ee! Ee!" I swung my leg without thinking. The kick was solid. The skeleton lifted off Bryce and hit the chalkboard with a hammering blow. Dad looked over and saw me standing above the red mass. I sent another kick to the skull. The eyes rolled in their sockets. One final whine escaped the jaw. My next kick knocked the jaw off its hinge and into the trash bin. I swung at anyone who got close and realized it wasn't Bryce's screams I heard now, but mine. My kicks had begun indenting the skeleton into the wall beneath the chalkboard. I heard twangs like guitar strings breaking as the high-tension fiber of the skeleton's synthetic muscle snapped, unraveling into locks of scarlet fiber. By the time I was pulled away and dragged into the hall, the skeleton was a loose mass of bone in a pool of gumbo. I heard later that something had rolled out of the pile, a single eyeball, staring into the fluttering overhead light. I got 3 weeks suspension, and Dad ran out of back-breaking labor for me to do. I spent hours defrosting freezers with ice picks. I pulled up tree trunks and shed my calloused palms like snakeskin. I rooted out raccoon nests until my arms were crisscrossed in long, thin scabs, and they looked like sunburnt aspen trees. My punishment continued through winter break. Many people told me they were sorry to lose my free labor and hoped my days as a delinquent would continue. In spring, science class moved on to physics, where the only bodies were celestial. There's one other thing I need to say. Back in community college, I took an internship with the county medical examiner. It helped ease the college admissions anxieties about my high school record, and I'm grateful to them. I kept my mind on my work, but when you work somewhere long enough, you can't help but pick up things. If you read between the lines of the medical reports and police files, you can put the picture together. There had been a car crash on the Cottonwood Creek Bridge, but it wasn't Dean who died. A family was driving across the bridge when they hit another car head-on. The family sedan burst into flames. No survivors. The other driver fled. Based on the impact damage, the other car was a big SUV, like an Escalade. Dean's family had an Escalade. There was a big dairy farm along Cottonwood Creek. They had a security camera pointed right at that bridge. The police report said one suspect was interviewed based on the video, but it went nowhere. I think Dean's father could buy silence and influence for his son, but covering up a fatal hit and run, one caught on candid camera, was the limit. I would guess his father had just enough money to make it go away, but in exchange, he had to promise that Dean would go home to China and never return. Without a school board to schmooze, the Guangzhou Sports Center stood incomplete. After an F4 tornado ripped up the county, the school board was caught using federal relief money to finish the building. I'm not sure it matters if Dean died or fled into exile. In that autumn biology class, I got to see what it might look like if my blackest, most hateful wishes came true. Maybe some people could handle that, given the chance. Maybe they'd even enjoy it. I pray they never have to find out. These days, I don't watch the news much, and I skip the Sunday sermons where Jesus invokes the hellfire. They dredge up too much wreckage from the depths. There are demons in this world. They go by names like rage, sloth, and paranoia. They possess us and remake our perceptions of the world in their own image. I've tried to purge those feelings, but some of it sticks around. Like the little girl at the end of The Exorcist, the demon is gone, but the priest's cross still makes us flinch. The skeleton's still deep in the closet. In fact, you could say that there's a skeleton inside all of us. The end. Well, thank you all very much for listening. Hope you found that entertaining, and I'd love to answer any questions or just listen to what you have to say now. If you have a YouTube account, just put it in the chat. You can also reach me on Twitter, or if you can text me, or email me, whatever. I'd be happy to listen. This is I guess the first thing I'd say is that the title of the story, some of you might be familiar with it. It's sort of it's a joke online that if you didn't care for a horror story, you didn't find it very scary enough, you'll comment on the story, and then a skeleton popped out. It's sort of, well, it wasn't that scary. And another one is like, well, but who was phone? Like someone's in your house on your phone line. So that's where then a skeleton popped out comes from. And when I was talking about horror stories and what I think good horror should be, I was thinking, could you do a horror story with a skeleton as the main focus that really was kind of troubling or unnerving? There is a story called The Skeleton in the Closet by Louisa May Alcott. You may not know that before she wrote Little Women, Louisa May Alcott had a flourishing career writing pulp fiction, basically. She wrote kind of what, it wasn't quite as graphic, but basically the niche that 50 Shades of Grey, sort of later you call it penny dreadfuls. She wrote a lot of those, and one of them was a short story called The Skeleton in the Closet, which I have read. Surprisingly, there isn't a skeleton in the story. It's meant in a metaphorical sense. And I guess another thing that I would say, one inspiration for this story was an engraver who lived in England in the 19th century, who's mostly forgotten now, but was a big success in his time. His name was William Hogarth. And basically all comic book artists today, and just the field of comics and modern designers, they owe a huge debt to this guy. If you ever have the chance, look him up on Wikipedia. And what he did was he wasn't interested in fine art and drawing fruit bowls or landscapes. He was really interested in human drama. So he'd draw these really elaborate tableaus, you could say, of scenes of licentiousness, and his goal was to show how you know abhorrent it was that things like this were happening in modern society. And the other thing he would do that made him so influential is that he had a series of images and together they told a story. And it was in a sense the beginning of the comic book. So it's a guy getting married to his mistress, and then he takes up gambling, and then he takes up dueling, and then finally death is always the last panel. Something bad happens to them, and unfortunately his stories begins all over again. But he did one called the 4 Stages of Cruelty that I thought was the 4 Stages of Cruelty. And it's about a guy, it's about a person from boyhood to death. And he starts cruel and he gets crueler. And in all of his engravings, like there's about 50 different things going on, and they could all be their own painting in their own right. But in the first panel, he's torturing a dog, and there's another boy who's trying to stop him, and you just see the look on the boy's face, the alarm on his face. Then in the second panel, he's become like a carriage master, and he's beating a horse to death. So anyway, what ends up happening to this guy? His name is Tom Nero. He gets his pregnant mistress to rob her employer, and he kills her, and he's caught doing this. And so the last panel, which I wrote a scene where Quint reads, he sees this last panel, and this influences his moment of hysteria. The last panel is that Tom Nero he has been executed, and his body is being dissected in a hospital. Because back then there was a law in Britain that you could execute that people who were executed would have their bodies donated to science, and their bodies would be cut up. And it was considered, the reasoning was that such horrible desecration of your corpse would dissuade you from committing a capital crime. But so his body there's all these learned men in this operating theater looking around, and they have sort of this very amused look on their faces. They're cutting up and they're weighing the organs, and a dog is starting, and it's sort of like, well, and so the moral, of course, is, well, here is this man's fate, that he, for all his cruelty, now he gets to be the spectacle of all these people. Behold the villain's dire disgrace, is what Hogarth writes. And there's it's sort of it's a New Testament idea that, your suffering doesn't end with death. It begins there. So, for all his cruelty, he's been executed, but now his punishment has only begun. And now he gets to be, humiliated beyond death for the crimes he did. And so that image stuck in my mind. Another famous, I love a lot of Hogarth's work. Gin Lane is his famous one, which is it's like an explosion of all these horrible things happening. And famously, there's this baby this woman's drunk, and she like passes out, and her baby is falling into this gutter, and it's just frozen in that instant of time. I can't imagine how it would have been to see his paintings at that moment. But I was also interested in if someone who's known as sort of a bad guy dies or disappears. I think a lot of times, like, people don't know how to feel about that. They, should I feel bad that I didn't like this guy? Do I feel bad that I don't feel worse about this person's passing? People have these mixed emotions, and I thought that was interesting to explore, but also kind of like, well, dark thoughts that we all have in life of, well, I wish a piano would fall on that guy's head. And so Quint, he sort of gets a glimpse of, well, what if he sort of starts to think, well, maybe I really did cause some supernatural torment to this guy. What is that, and now I get to watch it happen to him. What would that feel like? So I liked thinking about those things. Oh my goodness. So running an extension cord for Mr. Jack-o'-lantern over here. Would anyone, I'm not seeing, if anyone has any questions in the chat, or maybe a question by text message, I'd be happy to answer that. There we go. Let's see, what else could I, and I was excited to write a story that was set in eastern Colorado. I've got a lot of story ideas up in the mountains, but half of the state is the wide open plains, and there's a lot of cool stuff out there. It's so remote. With this, I'd say about 15 minutes past the west side of E470. It's barren out there, and I was interested in kind of exploring that a little bit. I didn't draw really anything from my own life for this story. I loved science class as a kid. The one thing that did happen, I did once put a staple through my thumb, and I did freak out. But fortunately, it didn't go through the bone. It just went through the skin on either side of the bone. But it's an alarming thing if you've never done it before, and you weren't if you do it by accident. So anyway, again, I want to thank you all for your patience and for listening. I hope that this has given you some entertainment as we come up on Halloween. Something I've gotten back into in recent years. The last thing I'd say is that if you are interested in hearing more stories like this, well, not all of them will be horror, and if you're interested in supporting short stories like this, I'm coming up. There's a website called Patreon, Patreon, and you can support voluntarily artists with their work. And for me, it would be that you would donate $5 per project, and each time someone releases a song, you choose to pay them some money, or a story, or a short film, or a little episode of animation. That's how it works. And so I'd be interested, if you're interested in doing something like that, I'd love to hear from you. I left my email address in the description, and you can also reach out to me on Twitter, or I also have it on my website. But if you're interested in something like that, a lot of people are doing it, and I really like the writing process. I've also written a novel, and I continue to write for Yellow Scene magazine. But I'd like to keep doing it, and if you'd be interested in supporting something like that, I would immensely appreciate it. But in the meantime, I hope I've given you some kind of thrill tonight, and I hope that you all stay warm this fall, and remember to vote in the midterms. Please be civil to each other. The person who's dropping off flyers in your neighborhood is probably a neighbor of yours. So please be warm this winter and civil with each other ahead of the midterms. And I hope you all have a happy, spooky Halloween. Good night.